Somewhere outside Brussels, in the hours before dawn on June 18th, 1815, thousands of exhausted soldiers stood in silence as the ground beneath their boots slowly collapsed into mud long before the first cannon ever broke the morning air. And what they were about to endure was not the kind of battle history usually remembers, but something far more suffocating, slow, and human than the word Waterloo has ever suggested. Because behind the famous name lies a reality few accounts ever fully describe, a reality where entire armies were already breaking down before they even saw the enemy. The sky above Belgium that morning was heavy and low, pressing down on fields that had turned soft and unstable after days of relentless rain, turning movement into punishment and formation into exhaustion, where every step forward cost more strength than most men had left to give. Across the ridges and farm roads, lines of soldiers from France, Britain, the Netherlands, and Prussia waited not like heroes preparing for glory, but like men caught in something they no longer fully controlled. Their uniforms damp, their supplies strained, their weapons difficult to manage in conditions that seemed designed to erase precision from warfare itself. No one on that field was fresh. No one untouched by the long campaigns that had dragged Europe through years of near-constant war. And yet they were expected to stand again, to hold again, to fight again as if exhaustion itself was not part of the equation. Somewhere beyond the horizon, commanders made their calculations, measuring distance, timing, and movement. But none of those calculations accounted for the simple human cost of waiting in silence while the sound of distant thunder rolled closer with every passing minute. There was something else in the air that morning, too. Something harder to define than weather or terrain, a sense that this battle had already begun long before anyone gave the order, that every march, every shortage, every sleepless night had already been shaping this moment into something heavier than strategy. Soldiers tightened their grips, not because they expected certainty, but because uncertainty had become the only constant they could trust. And in that uncertainty, rumors moved faster than messengers, carried along the lines in broken voices and half-heard fragments of news about positions, reinforcements, and movements that no one could fully confirm. What they did not yet understand was that Waterloo would not unfold like a clean sequence of attacks and responses, but as a slow compression of human endurance, where time itself seemed to stretch and bend under the weight of constant pressure. And somewhere within that rising tension lay details that official reports would later simplify, moments of hesitation, misjudgment, and exhaustion that never made it into the polished version of history. Fragments of truth that remain buried beneath the surface of one of Europe's most studied battles. To understand what happened here, it is not enough to look at maps or dates, because the real story begins in this quiet, suspended moment before the first shot, where thousands of men stood waiting in a landscape that had already begun to betray them, unaware that the coming hours would turn exhaustion into collapse and silence into something far more unforgettable than victory or defeat. As the morning slowly unfolded, what became increasingly clear was that nothing about this moment matched the simplified versions of it that would later appear in textbooks. Because the reality on the ground was not a carefully arranged confrontation between perfectly positioned armies, but a fragmented and uncertain situation shaped by timing failures, communication delays, and conditions that no plan had fully accounted for. The night before had already stripped much of the confidence from both sides, as messages moved slowly across muddy roads, and commanders tried to interpret incomplete reports while dealing with exhausted units that had already been pushed far beyond normal limits. On the French side, the expectation had been speed, decisive pressure, and rapid disruption of the opposing positions before coordination between enemy forces could fully form. Yet what they faced instead was a landscape that resisted movement itself, where horses struggled for footing and artillery required more effort to reposition than anticipated. On the opposing side, the Allied forces under Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, were not in a state of comfort or strategic ease, but rather holding a defensive line under constant uncertainty about when and how the main attack would develop, with every delay adding psychological weight to already strained formations. What made this situation fundamentally different from earlier engagements in the same wars was not just the presence of multiple armies converging in the same region, but the lack of clarity in how and when those forces would fully engage, especially with Prussian units under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher still maneuvering in the wider operational area, their arrival uncertain in timing but critical in influence. This created a battlefield environment defined not by immediate collision, but by anticipation under stress, where every hour of waiting eroded stamina and concentration. Commanders on both sides attempted to impose structure on a situation that was constantly shifting beneath them, sending orders that often arrived late or were interpreted under difficult conditions, leading to partial movements rather than coordinated action. The terrain itself played an active role in shaping outcomes, as the heavy rainfall had transformed open fields into surfaces that slowed movement and reduced the effectiveness of traditional formations, forcing units to adjust in real time rather than execute pre-planned maneuvers. Even communication between adjacent divisions became inconsistent, as visibility changed with shifting smoke, fog, and distance, creating moments where entire groups operated without full awareness of what was happening beyond their immediate position. In this environment, the idea of a single decisive opening clash gave way to a more complex and uneven unfolding of events, where pressure accumulated gradually rather than releasing in a single moment. What soldiers experienced was not the clarity of battle lines advancing and retreating in clean cycles, but a growing sense that the situation was becoming harder to read with each passing hour, as expectations and reality continued to drift apart. This gap between planning and experience would become one of the defining characteristics of the day, shaping every decision that followed and setting the stage for a confrontation that was far less predictable than any of its participants had been led to believe. As the uncertainty of timing continued to shape the atmosphere across the fields south of Brussels, both sides began transitioning from anticipation into positioning, where the abstract tension of waiting slowly transformed into structured movement across a landscape that still resisted certainty. On the French side, Napoleon Bonaparte remained focused on restoring initiative through controlled pressure, aware that the success of his plan depended not only on direct confrontation, but on the ability to disrupt the alignment of opposing forces before they could fully coordinate with one another. Yet, even as orders were issued with increasing urgency, the physical reality of the terrain continued to slow execution, forcing units to adjust spacing, timing, and direction in ways that were not originally intended. Across the field, the forces under Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, maintained their defensive arrangement along a ridge that offered limited but essential structural advantage, not as a static position of comfort, but as a carefully chosen line designed to absorb and distribute pressure over time. The Duke himself remained closely attentive to the timing of developments, aware that the integrity of the entire arrangement depended on discipline and endurance rather than rapid movement or early initiative. Meanwhile, beyond the immediate operational area, Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher were actively maneuvering through difficult conditions, attempting to reach the engagement zone in time to influence the outcome, though exact timing remained uncertain and subject to the same delays affecting all movement across the region. This overlapping uncertainty created a rare situation in which three separate command structures were operating within the same theater without complete synchronization, each relying on assumptions about the others that could not yet be confirmed. As the morning progressed, communication between units became increasingly fragmented, with reports arriving late or incomplete, forcing commanders to make decisions based on partial information rather than full situational awareness. The landscape itself continued to impose constraints on visibility and coordination, as shifting atmospheric conditions reduced long-range observation and made it difficult to confirm movements beyond immediate proximity. In this environment, even small delays carried strategic weight, as time itself became a limiting factor in how effectively forces could align their intentions with actual execution. Within the ranks, soldiers continued to adjust to the conditions of waiting under pressure, maintaining formation while conserving strength, aware that the coming hours would require sustained endurance rather than brief bursts of action. The sense of expectation grew heavier as the morning advanced, not because of any single decisive event, but because of the accumulation of small uncertainties that together shaped the psychological atmosphere of the field. Each side understood that once full engagement began, the situation would shift rapidly, but until that moment arrived, they remained suspended in a state defined by preparation without resolution. It was within this prolonged interval of structured anticipation that the foundations of the day's outcome were being formed, not through immediate confrontation, but through the gradual convergence of exhausted armies, delayed coordination, and the narrowing space between expectation and reality. As the day continued to unfold, the landscape itself began to define the rhythm of events more than any command issued from either side, because the terrain south of Brussels was not simply a neutral surface on which armies met, but an active force that shaped movement, visibility, and decision-making at every level. The ridge held by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, remained the central anchor of the defensive arrangement. Yet even this advantage was constantly tested by the conditions surrounding it, where softened ground and uneven fields made repositioning slower and more demanding than anticipated. Across the opposing lines, French formations under Napoleon Bonaparte continued to adjust their alignment in response to evolving conditions, attempting to apply pressure in a controlled manner while maintaining cohesion across units that were increasingly affected by fatigue and environmental strain. Between these two systems of command, the battlefield was divided into zones that were less defined by clear boundaries and more by shifting areas of influence, where control could increase or diminish depending on timing and coordination rather than fixed positions. Key locations along the field, including fortified farm complexes such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, began to take on heightened importance, not because of their size, but because of their ability to anchor movement and channel the flow of engagement across narrow and contested approaches. These structures, surrounded by open fields and intersecting lines of fire, became focal points where pressure naturally concentrated, shaping how both sides allocated attention and resources. Further along the ridge, the area near Mont Saint-Jean provided additional depth to the defensive arrangement, creating layers of position that allowed for gradual absorption of sustained pressure rather than immediate collapse under concentrated effort. As movements began to intensify across multiple points, coordination became increasingly complex, with units required to respond not only to direct opposition, but also to changes occurring simultaneously in adjacent sectors of the field. The communication between divisions remained inconsistent, often delayed by terrain and visibility, which meant that local commanders frequently had to interpret unfolding conditions in real time without complete situational awareness. This created a pattern of decision-making that was reactive rather than fully planned, where small adjustments in position or timing could have disproportionate effects on nearby formations. On the French side, efforts to maintain operational momentum were challenged by the same environmental constraints, as the ground conditions reduced the speed of advance and complicated the alignment of coordinated movements across wider sections of the battlefield. Despite these difficulties, pressure continued to build gradually along multiple points, not through a single decisive breakthrough, but through a series of overlapping engagements that stretched resources and attention across the entire front. On the opposing side, defensive discipline remained essential, as units were required to hold positions under continuous uncertainty, maintaining structure even as the conditions around them shifted in unpredictable ways. The result was a battlefield environment defined less by sharp transitions and more by sustained strain, where the outcome would depend on endurance, timing, and the ability to adapt under continuous pressure. In this evolving situation, the importance of terrain, coordination, and resilience became increasingly apparent, as each element interacted with the others to shape a conflict that was unfolding not as a single moment of decision, but as a prolonged test of organization and human endurance across a landscape that offered no stability beyond what could be actively maintained. As the pressure across the battlefield continued to build, the nature of the engagement began to shift from structured positioning into something far more fragmented, where coordination between units became increasingly dependent on immediate circumstance rather than pre-established plans. Along the ridge held by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, defensive formations remained in place, but their function was now tested by the constant demand to respond to multiple points of tension occurring across different sectors of the field. The farm complexes positioned in front of the main ridge, including Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, became central reference points in this evolving situation, not because they represented strategic objectives in isolation, but because they influenced the movement and attention of surrounding forces. These locations acted as structural anchors within the wider landscape, shaping how pressure was distributed across the front line and requiring continuous reinforcement of nearby positions. On the opposing side, French formations under Napoleon Bonaparte continued to apply measured pressure across multiple approaches, attempting to identify areas where defensive coordination could be disrupted through sustained concentration of effort. However, the effectiveness of these movements was increasingly shaped by external conditions, particularly the uneven terrain and reduced mobility caused by earlier weather patterns, which slowed transitions and complicated the timing of coordinated actions. As a result, what might have been planned as synchronized advances instead unfolded as staggered developments, where individual units encountered varying levels of resistance depending on their location and timing. Communication between commanders and frontline positions remained inconsistent throughout this phase, with messages often delayed or altered as they moved across the field, creating gaps in awareness that required rapid interpretation at lower levels of command. This led to a situation in which local decisions carried significant weight, as small adjustments in positioning or timing could influence the stability of adjacent formations. Within the defensive lines, maintaining cohesion became a continuous process rather than a static condition, requiring repeated reinforcement of structure as conditions shifted around key points of contact. The area surrounding Mont Saint-Jean provided additional depth to this arrangement, allowing for layered positioning that could absorb fluctuations in pressure while preserving overall stability. Meanwhile, across the broader operational area, the movement of Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher continued to develop, introducing an additional variable into the evolving situation, though their exact timing and influence remained uncertain at this stage. This uncertainty contributed to a broader sense of instability across the field, where both sides were required to operate without full clarity regarding future developments. As the hours progressed, the battlefield increasingly reflected a pattern of overlapping pressures rather than isolated engagements, with multiple points of focus emerging simultaneously and requiring continuous attention. In this environment, the distinction between preparation and execution became less defined, as forces were repeatedly required to transition between anticipation and response without clear separation. The cumulative effect of these conditions was a gradual increase in operational strain across all formations, shaping the battlefield into a complex and evolving system where outcomes were determined not by a single moment of action, but by the sustained ability to adapt under continuous uncertainty. As the operational pressure across the battlefield reached a new level of intensity, the structure of engagement began to shift in a way that could no longer be described simply as a series of coordinated maneuvers, but instead as a continuous test of endurance and adaptability under rapidly changing conditions. Across the ridge held by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, defensive formations remained intact, yet they were now operating under increasing strain as multiple sectors of the field required simultaneous attention. The earlier stability provided by terrain and positioning was still present, but it was becoming progressively harder to maintain without constant adjustment. On the French side, under Napoleon Bonaparte, efforts to apply pressure across key points of the Allied line continued, but the effectiveness of these actions was increasingly influenced by timing delays and uneven coordination between different units, which reduced the predictability of outcomes across the field. At several points along the central and forward areas of engagement, mounted formations advanced in a series of coordinated movements designed to test the resilience of defensive positioning. But these advances encountered structured resistance that required repeated reassessment of approach and timing. The interaction between mobility and stability became one of the defining characteristics of this phase, as neither side was able to fully establish uninterrupted control over any major sector. Within the defensive arrangement, infantry formations maintained disciplined structural configurations that allowed them to absorb repeated pressure without breaking formation, relying on cohesion and spacing rather than rapid repositioning. However, even this stability was continuously challenged by the need to respond to shifting concentrations of movement across different points of the field, requiring commanders at multiple levels to interpret developments in real time without complete information. Communication delays continued to influence decision-making, creating a situation where local conditions often dictated immediate responses more effectively than centralized planning. Meanwhile, across the wider operational environment, the presence of Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher became increasingly relevant, as their movement toward the engagement zone introduced a growing factor of external influence that neither side could fully ignore, even though its precise impact remained uncertain. This uncertainty contributed to a broader sense of instability, as both French and Allied formations had to consider the possibility of additional pressure arriving from new directions while already managing existing demands. As the engagement progressed, the battlefield increasingly functioned as a layered system of overlapping pressures rather than a single continuous front, with multiple points requiring simultaneous attention and adjustment. The result was a condition in which traditional expectations of linear progression were replaced by a more complex pattern of interaction, where timing, positioning, and endurance all played interconnected roles. Within this environment, even small shifts in alignment or concentration could influence surrounding sectors, creating cascading effects that required constant recalibration by commanders and units alike. The cumulative effect of these conditions was a gradual transformation of the battlefield into a highly dynamic and unstable system, where control was never absolute, but constantly negotiated through continuous adaptation. It was within this evolving structure that the decisive phase of the engagement began to take shape, not as a single moment of breakthrough, but as the gradual convergence of multiple pressures reaching their operational limits at different points across the field. As the engagement reached a critical phase of sustained pressure across multiple sectors of the battlefield, the nature of combat conditions shifted further away from structured, predictable interaction and into a prolonged state of continuous strain, where the effectiveness of any action depended less on initial planning and more on the ability to adapt under rapidly changing circumstances. Across the ridge held by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, defensive formations continued to operate within their established positions, but the conditions surrounding them required constant internal adjustment as pressure emerged from multiple directions in overlapping sequences. The stability of the line was no longer defined by static strength, but by the capacity of units to maintain cohesion while responding to repeated shifts in operational focus. On the opposing side, under Napoleon Bonaparte, French formations continued their attempts to maintain momentum through coordinated advances across key sectors. Yet the execution of these movements was increasingly affected by accumulated fatigue, environmental resistance, and fragmented communication between command levels. This created a situation in which planned synchronization gradually transformed into staggered execution, where individual units acted within partial awareness of broader developments. Within this evolving structure, certain areas of the field began to experience sustained periods of concentrated operational pressure, requiring repeated reinforcement and adjustment from nearby formations in order to prevent structural weakening. The interaction between movement and resistance became more pronounced, as neither side was able to establish uninterrupted control over any major segment of the engagement zone. Instead, control shifted continuously in localized patterns, influenced by timing, positioning, and the ability of units to maintain coherence under sustained demand. As the hours progressed, the psychological and physical condition of personnel across both sides became an increasingly significant factor in shaping the overall tempo of events. Extended periods of waiting, combined with intermittent bursts of high-intensity activity, created a rhythm that placed continuous strain on attention and endurance, reducing the effectiveness of decision-making at multiple levels. Within this environment, the distinction between preparation and execution continued to blur, as forces were repeatedly required to transition between static positioning and immediate response without clear separation between phases of action. Meanwhile, the broader operational context continued to evolve as the movement of Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher advanced closer to the engagement zone, introducing an additional layer of complexity that influenced planning considerations across both command structures. Although the precise timing of their arrival remained uncertain, their presence increasingly functioned as a variable that affected interpretation of risk and opportunity throughout the field. This uncertainty contributed to a growing sense that the situation was approaching a threshold point, where accumulated pressures from multiple directions would begin to converge more directly. Across the battlefield, communication delays and limited visibility continued to shape the flow of information, requiring localized interpretation of incomplete reports and reinforcing the importance of immediate tactical judgment. As a result, the overall structure of the engagement became defined less by centralized control and more by distributed decision-making under pressure, where outcomes were shaped by the cumulative effect of numerous smaller actions rather than a single decisive moment. It was within this condition of sustained operational strain, overlapping uncertainty, and converging external pressure that the battlefield began transitioning toward its most decisive phase, where the balance between endurance, timing, and coordination would determine the final structural outcome of the engagement. As the engagement entered its final and most critical phase, the accumulated pressures that had been building across the battlefield began to converge in a way that fundamentally altered the structure of the conflict, shifting it from a prolonged test of endurance into a rapidly destabilizing sequence of cascading developments across multiple sectors. On the ridge held by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, defensive formations that had been maintained under continuous strain were now required to absorb increasing levels of coordinated pressure while simultaneously responding to developments emerging from unexpected directions. The earlier balance between stability and adaptation began to erode as the frequency of demands placed on individual units exceeded the capacity for rapid adjustment under existing conditions. On the French side, under Napoleon Bonaparte, efforts to maintain operational momentum continued, but the effectiveness of these actions was increasingly constrained by the combined impact of fatigue, fragmented coordination, and the growing complexity of the battlefield environment. Units that had previously operated within loosely synchronized frameworks now found themselves reacting to shifting conditions with reduced clarity, as communication delays and environmental limitations continued to interfere with the transmission of timely and complete information. At this stage, the movement of Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher became a decisive external factor, as their arrival on the wider battlefield began to introduce a sustained level of additional pressure that altered the equilibrium across multiple points of engagement. This development did not function as a single moment of impact, but rather as a progressive reinforcement of Allied positioning, gradually increasing the strain on French formations that were already operating near their operational limits. As these conditions evolved, the structure of the battlefield began to shift from a series of parallel engagements into a converging system, where separate lines of pressure increasingly interacted with one another in ways that reduced flexibility and limited the ability to reposition effectively. Within this environment, the importance of maintaining coherence under stress became more pronounced, as units on both sides were required to preserve structural integrity while responding to an expanding range of operational demands. The cumulative effect of these developments was a noticeable reduction in the ability of French forces to sustain coordinated action across the entire field, as localized disruptions began to influence adjacent areas with greater frequency. On the Allied side, the defensive arrangement maintained under Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, continued to function as a stabilizing framework, absorbing pressure through layered positioning and disciplined retention of key terrain features. However, even this structure was increasingly influenced by the broader shifts occurring across the battlefield, as external developments began to reinforce internal resistance at critical points. As the situation progressed, the distinction between isolated engagements and the overall structure of the battle became less defined, with individual sectors increasingly reflecting the cumulative influence of multiple simultaneous pressures. The battlefield, once characterized by extended phases of uncertainty and distributed action, now moved toward a condition of convergence, where the interaction between timing, positioning, and external reinforcement began to determine the overall direction of events. It was within this environment of escalating complexity and diminishing operational clarity that the final structural balance of the engagement began to take shape, as multiple systems of pressure reached their limits at different points across the field, producing a coordinated shift in momentum that would define the outcome of the entire day. As the final structural balance of the battlefield began to collapse into its concluding phase, the environment across the entire field south of Brussels shifted into a state where coordination, timing, and endurance were no longer separate elements, but fully merged into a single, continuous process of survival and adaptation under extreme pressure. On the ridge held by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, defensive formations that had been maintained through hours of sustained strain were now functioning at their absolute operational limit, absorbing the combined effects of repeated pressure, reduced flexibility, and the growing influence of external movements converging from multiple directions. On the opposing side, under Napoleon Bonaparte, French formations that had spent the day attempting to maintain structured momentum were now experiencing a progressive breakdown in cohesion, as the cumulative impact of fragmented communication, environmental resistance, and continuous operational strain reduced the ability to coordinate action across the wider field. At this stage, the arrival and integration of Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher had fully transformed the wider operational environment, introducing sustained pressure that extended across multiple sectors and reinforced the existing defensive structure while simultaneously limiting the remaining flexibility of opposing formations. This convergence did not manifest as a single isolated moment, but rather as a gradual tightening of conditions across the entire battlefield, where separate areas of pressure increasingly interacted with one another until independent movement became significantly constrained. Within this final phase, the battlefield functioned less as a collection of distinct engagements and more as a unified system under maximum stress, where every adjustment in one sector influenced stability in another. Defensive lines that had held through earlier phases of uncertainty now operated under conditions where preservation of structure depended entirely on continuous internal discipline and the ability to absorb sustained pressure without fragmentation. On the opposing side, efforts to maintain coordinated action became increasingly difficult as overlapping demands from multiple directions reduced the effectiveness of centralized control, forcing reliance on localized decision-making under rapidly changing conditions. As this process continued, the distinction between control and reaction became increasingly blurred, with both sides operating in an environment where outcomes were determined by accumulated strain rather than isolated actions. The landscape itself, already transformed by earlier conditions, now reflected the full weight of the day's developments, as movement across the field became increasingly uneven and constrained by the combined effects of terrain, timing, and sustained operational fatigue. When the final structural shifts occurred, they did so not as a single visible break, but as a series of interconnected adjustments that collectively altered the balance of the engagement. What remained after this transition was not a sudden sense of closure, but a gradual recognition that the operational dynamics sustaining the conflict had reached their final limits. In the hours that followed, as formations disengaged and movement across the field slowed, the environment settled into an unfamiliar stillness that contrasted sharply with the intensity of what had preceded it. Yet, even in this relative quiet, the effects of the day did not disappear. They remained embedded in the physical landscape and in the memory of those who had endured it. The field itself, once defined by continuous motion and pressure, now held a different kind of weight, shaped not by immediate action, but by the accumulation of experience across a single prolonged day. And in that silence, one question remained without resolution, lingering beyond the end of visible events. How many of those who stood there that morning ever truly left the battlefield, and how many remained in it long after the final movement had ended?